Okay, today I'm doing a PowerPoint. In addition, I understand from the comments we got online last week that the whiteboard was a little hard to see in terms of the. We're still a touch hot. Somehow we're just right on the brink of going crazy at every. Okay, that's much better. Whatever you just did, that's good. Yeah, suddenly the echo went. Okay, so I'm going to write much larger when I write now. And so thanks for the comments, you folks online, and let me know again if that is difficult to read. We're trying to work out the little technical difficulties as we go, but the PowerPoint should actually help. We're going to do a bit of a brief review, and good, this clicker is working. I like that. So what we covered yesterday, or I keep saying yesterday or last night, because for me, it's very present, but of course for you guys, it's all been a week. So typically in a college course, we'll meet 2-3 times a week, and so it ends up being a lot more present in your mind all the time. And we know that pedagogically speaking, repetition is the essence of learning. So both what you read online will be repeated here, and then we'll go through many salient points again and again as we go forward. But please do stop me at any given moment and ask questions. We have some ambient mics that hopefully will pick up people's questions better so that people online can actually hear them. But if that doesn't work, again, let us know. We'll do a roving mic. We want the question and answer to be as efficient as possible. So last week, we started talking about the nature of philosophy and where we're headed with this course. And to sum up, this course is not going to accomplish some of the things that I'm sure some Christians would like to see it accomplish. I'm sure there's a lot of Christians who either are watching this live, watching it online, or will watch the DVDs later, who will end up saying, wow, you mean I got to go through all this and you don't even prove the truth of Christianity? Well, it's not going to happen. We're not even going to prove that evolutionary theory is false. But in the marketplace of ideas, plausibility trumps almost all. There are very few things in life that you can prove without any shadow of a doubt. But in the marketplace of ideas, the most plausible ideas are the ones that emerge and have lasting power. And so what we're attempting to establish in this course is a much lower bar than disproving evolution or proving Christianity. What we're trying to do is to say Christianity and religions like it are not intellectually barren, and evolutionary theory is not nearly as plausible as it is believed in a widespread fashion. Another thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually explain very systematically what science is, what the practice of science actually is accomplishing, what science can in principle do. Shockingly, most scientists themselves do not actually know what it is they're doing. They've learned an approach in their given little narrow discipline, and as in most academic fields, they've become extremely narrow and focused. They're experts in a tiny slice. And that's great. I mean, that's how science progresses well. That's how academic disciplines progress well. You become expert in small slices. Wonderful. The problem is, scientists don't back up, get the big picture, and really look at what science is doing, what it in principle can do. But philosophy of science does a really excellent job of analyzing that very thing, and so philosophers are uniquely qualified to sort of hold science to account and be sure that good science is being done and that conclusions science is drawing are not illegitimate conclusions. We're also going to be looking at, or in the process of that, obviously we're going to lower the credibility of science. At this point, science is widely construed to be the truth-gathering mechanism. But in actual point of fact, brace yourself, this is a very audacious statement, science is not a truth-gathering mechanism. Now you're thinking, that's insanity, that's absurd. There's no way you can sustain that claim. And what I mean by that claim is science is not telling us about reality. Okay? I'm going to defend that claim as we go forward. I realize it's an audacious claim. Science is not a truth-gathering mechanism about the nature of reality. That's not what science is. That's not what science can do. I know that's how it's advertised. I know that we get microwave ovens and space shuttles that don't blow up most of the time, and so that looks like science is telling us about reality, but in fact it's not. And so we're going to sustain that claim. Then we're going to go on to point out various aspects of reality that even the process and mechanism of science cannot possibly, cannot in principle, give us an account of. So we are saying we're going to take a philosophical approach. We're going to back up. We're going to sort of get underneath what science is. We're going to get underneath the way we do evidential analysis. That's going to include the way we analyze the Bible. And I made a claim last Sabbath in which I said, even the Bible, you don't just get the Bible. You don't just open up the Bible, leaf to a page, put your finger on a verse, and go, Holy Spirit, tell me what it means. That's not how it works. That's not how it can work. So we do philosophizing all the time in all sorts of different contexts, and we do that by analyzing arguments. So what is an argument? If we're going to be talking on and on and on about arguments, and now we are having our first technical difficulty. It's not advancing. Can you give me a space? There we go. We'll try it a few times. Maybe, Jesse, you're going to have to end up doing the space thing again. I'll just tell you next. That's probably our easiest way. So let's see if it works next time. All right. Most people think of an argument as two people butting heads. They're having an argument. That's not what we mean. Philosophically speaking, an argument is not a disagreement between two people. Next. An argument is really an abstract entity. It's like a self-contained entity that you can back up and take a look at and evaluate. Next. So it is an attempt to establish a conclusion and evaluate whether or not that conclusion is actually true. Next. And because the argument is an entity that can be evaluated, all arguments have a certain sort of structure. And that structure itself is evaluatable, and that's part of what we're going to be doing. Now, this is all very important because as we're going forward with this course, I need to be referencing all kinds of pieces of how we think, in principle, what the fundamental basis of thinking even is. And we're going to be assembling all kinds of pieces of a puzzle out on a table. So right now, you're kind of going, wow, I feel like I'm just getting this shotgun blast of information. Well, it's very much like this. Let's say that we're doing a jigsaw puzzle, and it's worse than if I lay a randomized jigsaw puzzle out on a table, and then your job is to start assembling the pieces. Because you look at some pieces and go, well, that's blue, let's put blue stuff together, maybe that's sky, this has some green in it, right? You know how you assemble a jigsaw puzzle. This is worse because I'm handing you pieces as we go. It's impossible for me to even lay the whole jigsaw puzzle out there for you and help you start assembling it. We have to start putting the pieces on the table first. Now, the upside is that as we're putting these pieces on the table, I'm going to be telling you that is a sky piece. The fact it's blue doesn't mean it's water, so you get confused and drag it down to the water part. It is actually a sky piece, and we're going to end up putting it in the sky eventually. So as we go, we're going to be laying a puzzle out, and I'm going to be telling you what kind of pieces these are going to relate to, and ultimately we're pulling this all together into one picture, and that picture is going to end up being a picture that I'm very confident you've never seen before. So just stay with me, and we'll get the pieces of the puzzle out on the table bit by bit. Part of the puzzle involves the actual structure of thinking itself, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So an argument, this is kind of a definition. You can write this down, or this is one that you can remember. An argument is a set of propositions, one of which is the conclusion. An argument always has one and only one conclusion. There might be 0 or more premises that are intended to provide logical support for the conclusion. So let's parse this out bit by bit. First of all, I'm talking about a proposition. I'm not saying statements. I'm not saying sentences. As we're going to distinguish in a few minutes, sentences are not the same things as propositions. But a proposition is what we're talking about. One proposition is the conclusion, and there might be many premises that are propositions that are intended to provide support for that conclusion, or there might even be none, because an argument might consist of a single statement that turns out to be logically true. In other words, just the structure of the statement itself makes it true. It's always true. It's impossible for it not to be true. For example, either the door is open or the door is not open. It's a true statement. You don't need to know anything about the state of the door to know that that statement is true, because it simply expresses what we call in logic the law of the excluded middle. It's saying we deal with truth as truth or falsity. So either the door is open is true, or the door is not open is true. One or the other is the case, and I don't need to know which in order to know that the disjunction itself is in fact a true statement. So I need no premises in order to logically support the truth of that conclusion. Okay, does that make sense? I'm seeing people nodding. I think you guys are following me here. So an argument could have no premises in support. But if there are premises in support of the conclusion, there must be a logical relation between them. Okay? We talked about this last week, where I gave you an argument that consisted of, this is a pen, this is a paper, this is a black table, this is a clicker that is not working anymore for some reason, therefore the sky is blue. All true statements, but there's no logical relation between them whatsoever. And so it can't be said that these premises are intended to provide logical support for this conclusion. Okay? So we want the premises tied to the conclusion in some way, and part of what we're going to analyze going forward is, what are the ways in which premises get tied to a conclusion? And there are two aspects to this relation. Next. Logic, which is what we're going to be talking about next week in some detail, that is what provides the form, the structure, the relations that take place within an argument. Next. And the linguistic aspects, which are the content. Okay? So every argument has two parts, two aspects, if you will, two elements. There is what we're going to call the formal relationship that exists between the premises and the conclusion. And when I say form, I mean indeed form. I mean it's empty, as you're going to see. And then there is the content. So let me give you a quick example here. And again, tell me if this writing actually is visible. Let's say that I give you an argument that looks like this. Now, how many of you think that is a good argument? This line signifies we're moving from the premises to the conclusion. This line acts like a thus or a therefore. Okay? This is the form of an argument. Okay? Let me plug in some content now. See what you think. For P and Q, we can use these to encapsulate or symbolize any simple proposition. So for example, I can say, P means it is raining. Q means the streets are wet. So now this argument is saying, if it's raining, because this symbolizes a conditional relationship between the two, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. It's raining, therefore the streets are wet. You like that argument? You think it's a good one? Some people are nodding, some are shaking their head. Okay, let me add to your confusion here before we clean it up. If the moon is made of green cheese, then all the rats on the moon are extremely well fed. The moon is made of green cheese. Therefore, all the rats on the moon are extremely well fed. You like that one? Again, some are shaking their heads, some are nodding. The fun thing for me is that some of the people that were nodding in the first case are shaking their heads in the second. And some that were shaking their heads in the first case are nodding in the second. Very interesting. Now, part of what we do as logicians, part of getting clarity regarding argument analysis, is we do go to symbols. And the reason for that is because the very first thing you always do in argument analysis is to see if the argument is structurally good, if the form of the argument even can possibly have the premises get you the conclusion. Now, I'm going to tell you something that you might say, wow, that's wacky. Every argument of this form is valid. Now, we're going to say valid is a technical term. I'm going to explain as we go what valid means. It doesn't mean all you might think it means. But what valid does mean is that every argument that has this form is such that the premises guarantee the conclusion. This form is so commonly used in our everyday thinking that it's even been named by logicians. This form is called modus ponens. Modus ponens. And every argument of this form is a logically valid argument. The form of the argument is rock solid. But we add a second aspect to it, and that is the linguistic aspect, the content aspect. And most people will say, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. Okay, I'll buy that. I mean, that's the way it works in the everyday world. If in fact it's also raining, then yeah, sure enough, the streets are wet. Right? I don't even have to go outside to know the conclusion is true. If I know these two premises are true, then I know the conclusion is true. But notice that I have to back away from the form and add content in order to know if the argument is in fact a sound one. And again, we're going to talk about what the word sound means. Okay? So notice how already we're going down the rabbit hole, right? I mean, already you're thinking, I've never thought of the way we talk in everyday life like this. I've never thought of it that way. But in fact, when we reason together, when we reason out of the scriptures, when we reason at all about evidence, this is what we're doing inside. And we can learn to do it more rigorously, more carefully, more correctly, or we can be like most people in the world who do it pretty badly, actually. And so when I say form and content, that's what I'm distinguishing between, is the structure of the relation, the inferential or logical relation between the premises and the conclusion, and then the linguistic content, the propositional content that you plug into these variables in order to see whether the argument makes it from valid to sound. Okay? Any questions about this so far? This is an important segue. Mike?
Where's it raining? It's raining in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
So what you're saying is that you don't agree with the truth of that premise. By the way, were people able to pick up Mike's question? Okay, that didn't come up. So next week, we're going to have to do the roving mic. So what Mike asked was, let's say you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There are no streets. Therefore, the fact it's raining does not get you that the streets are wet. So Mike is making a very good point, and that is, this relation does not always hold. This conditional relation does not always hold. So Mike is saying, you start plugging content into this, and you don't get the truth of the first premise. That doesn't affect the structural validity of the whole argument. in any scenario in which these premises are true, it's impossible for this conclusion to be false. You've just come up with a scenario in which not all the premises are true. But in any scenario that these premises are true, the conclusion necessarily will be. So do you follow what I'm saying about structurally, true premises guarantee the conclusion. But when we add soundness, when we add content, when we add evaluating whether or not these premises are in fact true, then we may find they're not true, in which case you don't get a true conclusion out of the mix. It's not assured that that conclusion is true. More questions? Okay, good. Can anyone think of an argument that would fit this form that people would agree, yeah, it's of this form, so it's valid, and the content is solid. This conditional relation, for example, is a good one, and therefore we accept the conclusion. Can anyone come up with an example? How about, if there's fire, then there's heat. There is fire, therefore there's heat. Is there any scenario in which you have fire but don't have heat? Electric fires, don't they generate heat? Is there anything that we call fire that fails to generate heat? Can't think of any. So we've come up with a scenario in which not only is the argument valid, but it's sound. And so we know this, right? I mean, as you're thinking to yourself about a scenario, or whether there's a counterexample to my suggested scenario, you intuitively know that where there's where there's fire, there's heat, right? You just intuitively know that. So you buy the first premise already. So all I have to do is tell you, wow, there's a fire going. And one of the implications that you immediately get, you don't have to be anywhere near the fire. The fire could be in another city. The fire could be in another country. But if you hear that there's a fire someplace, you employ a reasoning process like this behind the scenes in your mind, and you instantly draw the conclusion, oh wow, it's hot. People can get burned up. Stuff's getting burned up. Do you see my point? All you need to hear is this, and you instantly jump to this because you already know this form works, and you intuitively already know this correlation. And so my point just is, we employ this kind of reasoning constantly in everyday life, and this form of reasoning is so common that logically it's even named. It's always good inferential reasoning. Always, without exception. It all depends on what content you plug into that form. Now, there are bad forms too. There's some that are so commonly employed, they've been named. And next week, we'll get into some of those. You'd be amazed at how many good-sounding arguments are in fact invalid. They don't even have good logical structure. In fact, their structure guarantees a disconnect between the premises and the conclusion. So next, as you're seeing already, we care very much about meanings. When you were thinking about my scenario, fire, heat, what were you doing? In the back of your mind, you were thinking things like, what do we really mean by fire? Right? That's what you were doing. You were doing linguistic analysis. You were getting at the meanings. You were asking yourself, could a fire be, right? And you were trying to dream up alternate ideas of what the word fire might mean. Because you knew that if you could come up with a legitimate meaning of the word fire that didn't in fact produce heat, you'd have a counterexample to my suggested scenario. And so, as you're doing argument analysis, you're doing both a formal analysis and a meaning analysis. You're thinking about what the words mean. And the very process of analyzing in this rigorous way is how philosophy proceeds. Next. So, now let's distinguish between sentences and propositions. This is a really crucial point. Next. The forms of speech we employ very much matter. So there are three major forms of speech. Next. We have commands, called imperatives. Next. We have questions, the interrogative form of speech. Next. We have a declarative, an informative form of speech, where we make statements. So let's distinguish between these, okay? Let's say I tell you, open the door. Now I'm issuing to you a command. It's clear by the way I say it that I'm commanding you, open the door. It would be really odd of you to respond to that command by saying, false. You might say, no, I won't, or how dare you command me? Who do you think you are? You could respond in all kinds of ways, but what you would not legitimately do is respond by saying false. And so we will say, commands do not contain propositions in the logically relevant sense. Okay? Just as we go, keep that in mind. Same thing with questions. Let's say I ask you, is the door open? Are you going to respond false? You might say no. You might say yes. But you're not going to affirm or deny the truth or falsity because I haven't made a statement. I've asked a question. So you're not going to say true or false. You'll say, yes, I affirm the door is open. In which case, you've just issued a statement. I've asked for information. I've asked for you to give me a proposition in return. And you do that by issuing an informative or declarative statement. And so we're going to say that only the last of the three is a form of speech that contains logically relevant propositions. And so we see that when you're doing questions or commands, you're not putting in what we're going to call propositional content. There's content, and in a broad sense, it could be called propositional content. But in a logically relevant sense, we're going to distinguish between the abstract entities that are propositions from these various three forms of speech. Only the last, only the informative declarative form conveys propositions. Next. So here's again a definition, one of two. Again, this is one to write down or review it online. All propositions have a truth value, while not all sentences do. And from my examples earlier, you should be able to see that, right? A proposition is contained in a declarative sentence. But there are other forms of sentences, and not all of those sentences convey propositions. When I ask a question, I'm not conveying a proposition. So sentences come apart from propositions in that not all sentences convey a proposition that has a truth value, whereas propositions themselves, by their very nature, convey a truth value. And sentences can vary in verbiage and language, while the conveyed proposition remains the same. Now, here's some examples of that. Next. Let's say I issue a proposition in which I say, for lunch, I had a grilled cheese sandwich. It's a proposition, has a truth value. Either I did, in fact, have that for lunch, or I did not. Either that statement is true, or that statement is false. Next. But I could also say, I could also convey the same proposition in totally different verbiage. I could say, for my midday meal, I had 2 slices of bread with a slab of aged, solidified mammal milk between them, and the whole was browned in a hot pan. Would you agree that I'm saying the same thing as my first statement? So notice, two totally different sentences conveying the same proposition. Are you seeing now how propositions and sentences come apart? They're not the same thing. A form of sentences convey propositions, but propositions are not sentences. Okay, next. I can't speak French, but Google Translate tells me that that is the exact same sentence as the first in French. Now, somebody should be raising their hand and correcting me right now. What did I just say that was wrong? I'm going to say it again. That third line is the exact same sentence as the first one, but in French. Heidi? I said the word sentence, didn't I? Exactly. Proposition. The third statement, the third sentence, has the exact same propositional content as the first sentence. Anyone ready to raise their hand again? Put your thinking caps on. See, this is what philosophers do, and this is why people hate philosophy. Because it requires you to be so careful, so rigorously clear, and most people just don't want to live like that. I actually have people at Ministerial Council a few weeks ago. I actually had a guy go up there saying, I hate when you're in the audience and I'm preaching because I feel like everything I say is coming under scrutiny, and I know I'm not as careful as I should be. Are you ever able to turn it off? Do you have an off switch? Okay? We're not going to have any off switch during the entire course. So I'm going to say this again. The third sentence conveys the same propositional content as the first, only in French. Is that true? Yes. Is it complete? Have I made a complete sentence? A complete statement of fact? Am I missing something? Okay, do you want to reverse that? You're saying the first sentence has more content than the second sentence. I think most people would say the second sentence says it a lot more thoroughly than the first. Same proposition. I mean, in a nutshell, the first sentence is a pretty good capture of the propositional content. But here's what you're missing. When I say the third sentence conveys the exact same propositional content as the first, you should be catching and the second. Are you seeing my point? The proposition is the same across all three. So when I say the third conveys the same proposition as the first, you should be saying, yeah, and the second. And so when I test students, this is how brutal and evil I am. I will do things like that, where I'm seeing all my exams are open book, open notes. I don't test on trivia. I test on understanding, comprehension, grasping, okay? And so I will ask questions designed to tease out whether people are following along and getting the implications. And the implication here is if the first and third are the same, all three are the same. Are you seeing the point? Sentences can vary in verbiage and language, yet the propositional content remains the same. It's the same proposition. This is how translation can even work. It's impossible to translate between languages unless you already accept the idea that there are abstract objects called propositions. I'm just going to throw that out there. It's been rigorously proved by Alonzo Church, but in fact, translation cannot proceed unless you buy the metaphysical belief that there are abstract entities called propositions. And it is these propositions that are conveyed by declarative sentences. Okay, next. Again, you're probably going to want to review, and so forth. Next. I have no control of my destiny here. Okay. The principle of charity. We talked a little bit about this last week. Now we're going to contextualize it more. Again, putting pieces on the table, puzzle pieces, starting to assemble them more and more. Okay. Charity. We don't mean love. We don't mean love in the biblical sense. What we mean is seeking genuine understanding. We mean intellectual honesty. Do you see my point? What we mean by philosophical charity is a way of approaching argument analysis. Remember, I distinguish between philosophers and lawyers. And I said, philosophers are applying the philosophical method, which we're beginning to learn, to truth-seeking. Whereas lawyers employ the exact same games, but for the purpose of winning arguments, for the purpose of winning cases. It's not about the truth as much as it's about how can I manipulate people's thinking in order to buy a certain set of propositions. Whether they're true or not is not relevant. Whether they're legally sustainable, that's what's relevant. So we call that kind of employment of the philosophical method sophistry. Sophistry opposed to charity. Charity has various points. We want to totally, carefully, rigorously understand the propositions that are being conveyed, so we don't get fixated on the sentences. Now you're starting to see the point to this distinction between sentences and propositions. I'm not going to get hung up on the verbiage. I'm going to attempt to see, what does that verbiage really mean? The author of the argument, whether verbally, whether in writing, the author of the argument has propositional content in mind that they're trying to convey verbally or in writing. And I don't get all hung up on the verbiage and go, but you said blah, 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 right? Instead, I'm going to say, you could have meant this. You could have meant this. There's various ways I could interpret that verbiage. My goal is not to come up with an interpretation that I can then slam. My goal is to come up with the correct interpretation, the interpretation the author of the argument actually intended. I'm analyzing the actual propositional content, not fixated on this or that particular verbiage. And that is so that I avoid straw manning. The straw man fallacy is where I erect a caricature of my opponent's argument, and then with great verve and flourish, I knock that argument down and talk about how awesome I am because what a garbage argument that is, when in fact, I'm not being charitable toward that argument. Our goal is charity, understanding. Next. So, we're evaluating content, and there is some subjectivity. The form, however, once I get what the form of the argument is, there I can employ objective, utterly rigorous inferential analysis. As I plug the content in, there's some subjectivity, some interpretation. So it's very important that I really tease out what the author intended. Next. We have two types of arguments. And that's going to tell us a lot about the form that we're going to employ and the rigor with which we're going to analyze those. Okay, so we have deductive arguments. Next. We've already talked about validity. Validity is evaluating the inferential connection between premises and conclusion. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for there to be any scenario in which all of the premises are true and the conclusion false. I'm going to say that again. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for there to be any scenario in which all of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. That's a long, rigorous, careful way of basically saying the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. An argument is valid when it is of such a form that if all the premises are true, it is guaranteed that the conclusion is true. The inferential relation is so tight that those premises guarantee you the conclusion. That's a valid argument. But valid is about form only. Next. Soundness adds that propositional content. Soundness says, not only is it the case that if all the premises were true, the conclusion would be also true, but all the premises are in fact true. But in order for us to know if all the premises are true, we have to plug content into it. I can't say, you can't just look at this right now, and I tell you, I'm going to plug whatever I want into Q at some point, but I want a commitment from you. Is Q true? Okay, come on. How many think Q is true? Watch out now. How many of you think Q is false? Okay, my point. No takers, right? Q being empty, you don't know if it's true or false. Truth and falsity is about content. Again and again, I'm going to make this distinction between form and content. Validity is about form. If these premises were true in some scenario, then in that same scenario, the conclusion would guaranteed be true. We want to start talking about scenarios, we're talking about content. We have to start plugging things into the P's and Q's, and then you tell me if you think it's indeed a true conclusion. Green cheese, mice on the moon, valid argument, not sound. Next. We also have inductive arguments. Next. Inductive arguments have a much weaker relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Here, the term that we're using is strong. An inductive argument is strong if it's the case that if all the premises are true, it's very likely that the conclusion is true. Okay? It's not guaranteed, but very likely. If the sun has risen throughout recorded history, then the sun will rise tomorrow. The sun has risen throughout recorded history. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. I think you guys would all readily agree that both of the premises are true. But is it guaranteed that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Does the past fact of the sun rising mean that tomorrow it will rise? Guaranteed? No. It's likely. I mean, with all the premises we could plug into this kind of an argument, it's very, very likely the sun is going to rise tomorrow. It's so likely that I don't think there's anyone in this room or watching online that's going to question that. You don't sit around going, it's not guaranteed. Maybe it won't, right? No one's doing that. So, it's not a deductively valid argument, but it's a pretty sound argument. I mean, a pretty strong argument, right? The relation between premises and conclusion, pretty tight. Not guaranteed, but pretty good. Next. We add the same thing then in the case of induction, where we then start evaluating content. And we say that an argument is cogent if it's both strong and the premises are true. So notice the way we're approaching this is exactly the same. First we look at the form, then we look at the content, and that tells us how good of an argument we're actually getting. Now, charity. Next. There is no tight formal relation in inductive argumentation. In induction, you cannot just look at the form and say, yeah, I see a really tight relation between them. Inductive arguments, by their formal nature, are not valid. Are you seeing my point here? If an inductive argument were valid, it would be a deductive argument. So the relation between the premises and the conclusion cannot be codified into valid form in inductive arguments. And I know that the example that I just gave you, because I'm appealing to the board, made it look as though I'm doing induction with a formal argument. Well, in fact, it wasn't of this form. I'm thinking of it in those terms, right? I mean, but there have to be other premises. Is there enough? Let's go through it again. Is there enough? If, down through recorded history, the sun has always risen, then the sun will rise tomorrow. Down through recorded history, the sun, down through recorded history, the sun has always risen. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Is that really a good example of induction? Was it in this form? Is this a valid form? Was it a deductive argument? Exactly. If it was in this form, it was a deductive argument. Notice when I talked about likelihood, you can say things deductively about likelihood. You see how this starts to get, I mean, again, you're thinking, wow, man, I didn't know there could be so many permutations to all this. Think about it this way. Let's talk about coin flips, okay? I can give you all kinds of premises about coin flips, and I can come up with a scenario in which my conclusion says something like, there's a 50% chance that the next coin flip will come up heads. I'm talking about chance, right? I'm talking about possibilities and probabilities. My conclusion is about likelihood, right? Just because I've got a likelihood conclusion doesn't mean I'm not doing deduction. When we do statistical analysis in mathematics, we're doing deductive mathematics to draw likelihood conclusions. So do not think that just because likelihood is mentioned, you're into induction. Okay? Are you seeing the point? So I've been talking for a few minutes now. Questions? I want to know if at this segue we're on the same page. Any questions? Or if you're not even sure how to ask your question, maybe you just want to say something like, I'm still not really clear whether that's inductive or deductive, or any questions? Okay, to do that, let's actually erase this, okay? Because we're not going to employ a deductive form at all. And so let's put up an argument that says something like P, Q, therefore R. Now, on the face of it, that's a completely ridiculous looking argument, right? Because on the face of it, that form is, this is a pen, that's a black table, therefore the streets are wet. Right? This is a pen, this is a black table, therefore the streets are wet. We've already agreed that's a completely ridiculous argument, right, Heidi? But it's ridiculous only in the sense that it's not valid. Right? It doesn't have a formal structure such that any kind of inferences here can work. We're not thinking inferentially in a logical, deductive sense. Could this be a cogent argument? Cogent in that sense. Could it be that these two premises, with the right content in them, would make it likely? So let's come up with an example here. We have flipped the coin 40 times. The coin has come up heads 32 of the 40 times. Therefore, there's a 50% chance that the coin will come up heads next time. I'm seeing some smiles now. Heidi. Ah, the gambler's fallacy. I love the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is, in a nutshell, all the past events that were odds-based somehow have an effect on the present event. If it is a fair coin, then any given flip has a 50-50 chance of coming up heads, if it's a fair coin. The problem with the gambler's fallacy is time slices. We are talking about a time slice in which 32 of 40 times have come up heads. All that means is over the course of a bigger time slice, you're going to end up with correspondingly 32 out of 40 tails come up at some point. Again, if it's a fair coin, meaning it's in fact an absolutely evenly weighted coin, and we even shave the edges down to a razor edge, but it's not so heavy it can embed itself in, right. This is the problem with induction, right? Is all the things you have to bring into play to get any clue of what you're really saying about the likelihood of a conclusion being the case. And this is why inductive arguments defy the kind of formal analysis that deductive arguments have, because it's impossible to do a strictly formal analysis of the relation between premises and conclusion. When you're doing induction, you have to be evaluating content constantly in order to even know if it's strong. With deduction, you can know if it's valid by simply analyzing the structure. You just look at the formal relations, you know if it's a valid argument or not. But with induction, it is impossible to do a purely, strictly formal analysis, because if you can, you're doing deduction, not induction. Now here's a crucial point. I'm going to emphasize this throughout the course of this course. Science is doing induction. I know they use math. I don't care. The inferences that science does are inductive inferences. They are not deductive inferences. Yes, some deduction does take place in science. But what science is doing as an enterprise is an inductive enterprise. And again, I'm going to sustain and support and develop and exemplify this point again and again and again. You're already seeing the problems with induction. It is an extremely unreliable way to evaluate arguments and to draw conclusions. However, we do it all the time. I gave you an example. You see me walking around. There is not a one of you who's thinking to yourself, I wonder if the floor is going to hold him the next time he takes a step. Not one of you has that question in your head. Yet, is there any guarantee that as I take this step, this floor is actually going to hold up under me? Is there any guarantee of it? None. I drive my car. I turn the wheel left, I go left. I turn the wheel right, I go right. I hit the brake, I stop. It happens so regularly, so continuously, that I don't even question what's going to happen when I turn the wheel. But is there any guarantee that the whole past series of events of turning my wheel left guarantees that when I turn the wheel left, it's going to turn the car left this next time? Is there any guarantee of it? None. And so, everyday activities are based on inductive inferences in which we derive from a whole set of past events the way the future is going to work. But such arguments are always invalid. Such arguments are always of a form like this. Such arguments are always, every single time I've turned the wheel left in the past, the car has turned left. I'm turning the wheel left. Guaranteed the car will turn left. Sorry, it's not deductively valid. There's no guarantee that those premises get you that conclusion. But we do it all the time. And it works most of the time. And that's what makes induction so intuitively compelling, is because that type of argumentation is something we do constantly. Hume calls it brute. It's a brute part of our psychology, Hume says. You can't justify it. If you actually back up and think about what's happening, it's kind of ridiculous, but it works so much that it's just become a psychologically brute part of the way we deal with the world. Now, science takes that exact brute psychology and tries to draw as close to guaranteed conclusions as possible. And in fact, the space shuttle doesn't blow up most of the time. Okay? Things turn out, by and large, the way science projects that they will. And therefore, science goes, yes, 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 look at how awesome we are. Look at the predictions we can make. And they turn out true. Wow, wow, wow. Right? And would any of you say that is a bogus way of thinking? No, because we do it all the time ourselves. We get in our car and we drive. And we don't sit around going, what next? You know, we don't do that. Induction is brute psychology. We do it constantly. It's the basis of our dealing with the everyday world. But when you take that brute psychology and start making broad, sweeping metaphysical claims with it, you've gone beyond what the form of argumentation will legitimately sustain. That's a crucial point about science. We're going to develop that more and more in detail as we go. Induction doesn't get you proofs. When you hear things like, science has proved, can't do it. In principle, it's impossible for science to prove anything. Scientists respond to that claim by saying, okay, only a philosopher would make a big deal about that. You know what we mean by prove is really kind of fluffy. I mean, strongly indicate, okay, that, you know, we say prove, we really mean pretty likely, okay? How high of a bar do you want to set, right? And, you know, they fudge around with it like that. But they say prove. And why I'm going to emphasize this is because people think prove. You hear it in the media so constantly that it becomes part of your brute psychology. Science proves, science proves, science proves. No, absolutely not. You know, big thing like that. No, science does not prove anything, ever, without exception. So when you constantly are hearing science proved or studies show or any verbiage like that, now put your thinking caps on. Big, huge thing you're getting out of this course right from the get-go. Huge plus for this course right now. Start thinking about what they're really saying. Start thinking about the verbiage. They prove nothing. Okay? They prove nothing. Induction can prove nothing. Okay, next. It can only make conclusion truth likely, and I would go on to say even that's sketchy, but it's really beyond the framework of this course to get into all the problems that there are with induction. Next. All right, charity again. Is it fair when an author of an argument intends that argument to be taken inductively, and we come swooping in and say, invalid, it's that. That's ridiculous. That's stupid. It's invalid. It's not even a good argument. Is that being charitable? No, it's not. If an argument is intended to be an inductive argument, it's ridiculous to hold it to the standard of deductive rigor. That is not charitable. If the author intends the argument to be of this form, then we don't bag on it because it's not in a deductively valid form. We have to evaluate the content. We have to see if it in fact makes the conclusion likely. Okay? Conversely, it's not fair if the author of an argument intends their argument to be compelling, a proof, and we treat it like it's just an inductive argument, you know, and we do this all the time too. I mean, believe it or not, it's extremely common when people say, I know what you're trying to do. I've had this countless times. I issue to somebody a deductively valid argument and one in which from discussion I already know they agree with the premises, and I think I'm proving the conclusion to them. They don't like the conclusion, so here's their response. I don't even know what logical games you're playing, okay? I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm not a logician. I don't buy that conclusion. I'm sorry. I feel like you're jerking me around. You're playing logical parlor games with me. I'm not up to speed the way you are. So sorry, I just don't accept the conclusion. I just don't accept it. That's not charitable. I'm sorry, it's not charitable. I intended to convince you, to compel you to accept a conclusion. I intended to do it with logical rigor, and you treat me as though I'm just issuing you some vague induction that, I can't assess it, therefore I'm not even going to deal with the inferences that you're making. I'm just not going to deal with it. Well, you're saying then, I don't do deductive rigor. I just don't do that. And so therefore, I treat everything as inductive. So maybe your conclusion's likely, maybe it's not, I don't know. Right? That's not charitable. If I'm doing good deduction, and you agree with the truth of my premises, you are compelled by intellectual honesty to accept the truth of that conclusion. I don't care if you like the conclusion or not. You're compelled to accept it. So don't treat my deductions as though they're inductions. And I'm telling people, scientists, atheists, who may be watching this later, down the road, in the future, I'm telling you right now, don't treat my attempted deductions as though they're fluffy inductions, because I'm attempting to make rigorous proofs of certain things I'm going to say. So it's not charitable, and it's not intellectually honest to treat my deductions as inductions. We have to know the form of the argument as it's intended, and we evaluate it accordingly. Next. Our goal, if there's a principle in charity, it is we're trying to give every argument its absolute best shot. We're trying to evaluate it according to the proper form. We're trying to see if we can make it a truly solid, valid argument, if that's acceptable, if that's appropriate. We're attempting to understand the verbiage so that we're getting the right propositional content in there. We're not looking to just bash the argument and do away with it. We're trying to make it as good of an argument as it can. Next. How can we know? Well, charity is necessary. If you're going to be intellectually honest, you have to be charitable. Next. But we have problems because sometimes we don't know what type of argument the author intended. Sometimes we're not clear on the propositional content. Next. Communication is critical. If I can talk to you face to face, then I can actually communicate, right? I can hear what you say, and I can say something like, I'm not clear on what proposition you're actually trying to convey here. I take it to mean this, but if that's what you mean, based on your argument, that has this kind of implication, but maybe you don't intend that implication. So am I getting your inferences right? Am I getting your propositional content right? We can communicate. But it's often the case, particularly in writing, we can't communicate with the author. And so the reason that philosophical literature often gets to be so ridiculously lengthy is because the only way philosophy can proceed with argument analysis the way I'm describing is that philosophers then will do this. If this is what you were doing and you were intending it to be deductive, then it fails with validity. But based upon your propositional content, I think you were intending to add an additional conditional premise in here, and if you did that, then in fact we could maybe make this valid, but you've said certain things that make me wonder if we can do that, and so what you're doing philosophically is you're going through all the different threads, and you're saying, if you intended this, then you get this, but maybe you didn't intend that because maybe you meant this instead, right? And so philosophical literature tends to be really loopy and long and difficult to read because what philosophers are doing is the process of what we call dialectic, where we're engaging back and forth, but we can't communicate face to face. So in the literature, we try to nail all the possibilities and respond to them. And then the original author responds and says, none of those, that's what I meant. I get your point, but I can address it by doing this. Pops off with another argument. Then the response is, well, okay, but, right? You see what I'm saying? And you might think, wow, this is incredibly inefficient and ridiculous and painful. And yeah, many people find philosophical argumentation very painful. However, philosophy has been the mode of human thought from the inception. There is nothing else. We do it better or worse, depending upon how charitable and careful. We are. Philosophy attempts to be as charitable and careful as possible. Next. Okay, argument identification is difficult. I'm going to whip through this. It's online. We'll talk about it more as we go, but I'm just going to whip through it with a couple of examples. Next. Do you really believe I killed him? If I had, would I have been so stupid as to leave evidence laying around? Well, both of these sentences are questions. Is that intended to be an argument? Some people are shaking their heads. Could be. In fact, if I were to argue with a cop that way, wouldn't I probably actually do it that very way? We often argue using questions. It's the question form of speech. That can be an argument. Again, be charitable. What's the intent? Next. The intent is actually to say, if I would have killed him, I would not have left evidence laying around. But there was evidence laying around. Therefore, I did not kill him. Quickly, that is another form of argumentation that we use all the time, so often, in fact, that it has been named if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. This form of argument is always valid. It's called modus tollens. That is exactly what the author of that argument is doing. It's a missing premise. There is a missing premise there. But, in fact, that is what the author of the argument is doing. If I would have killed him, I would not have left evidence laying around. But there was evidence laying around. It's not the case that I didn't leave evidence. Therefore, it's not the case that I killed him. You see the point? Formally valid argument, legitimate if all the premises are true. We argue this way all the time. We often do it in questions. Next. Next. Same kind of thing here. I'm going to whip past this one. Next. Next. Okay, non-standard order premises in conclusion. Sometimes when we talk, we put the conclusion first and then trot out the reasons why we believe it. We often are not clear about our indicator words. We don't say things like thus and therefore. You know, we don't do that often in the case. Ergo, when's the last time you heard someone say ergo? Okay? Not a real common form of speech. All right? But we do it all the time. Next, let's look at what this is really saying. If everyone is wearing the fashion, it must be the hot new fashion. Everyone is wearing it, therefore it must be the hot new fashion. Can anyone tell me what form of argument that is? No? What formal? The first one, modus ponens. Exactly right. You're starting to see it. How many of you ever saw the movie The Matrix? Quite a few. Notice there's a point in the movie where all of a sudden he can see the code. That's what I want you to start doing when it comes to basic argumentation. I want you to be able to see the code, see what's really happening. That is modus ponens. See, more and more, you're going to see the code. You're going to say, well, the first premise is if, then. And the next line is just reiterating the first part of the first premise. And then the conclusion is just the second part of the first premise. Anytime I see that, it's if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Oh, that's modus ponens. That's always a valid argument. Okay? Next. No indicator words, non-standard. Next. I can't hear you clearly. You will have to speak louder. Next. If you want to hear me clearly, you will have to speak louder. You do want me to hear you clearly, therefore you will have to speak louder. What form of argument is that? The first, again, exactly. Modus ponens, all over again. We do certain inferential forms constantly. We argue in modus ponens constantly. We argue in modus tollens constantly. We employ these basic inferential forms constantly. Start recognizing them in everyday arguments. Would you have gotten modus ponens from the first one? No. It's not of the right form. You have to be charitable to think through what's really being said by the first one, give it its strongest case, recognize, I see the code. That can be modus ponens. I can make that a good, solid argument if I just help the guy a little bit and turn it into modus ponens. Then I can ask, is that what you meant to say? Yeah, that's what I meant to say. That's exactly what I was saying. It's lengthier. If you want to get all hung up in the verbiage, then yeah. But I'm being charitable. Now it's modus ponens. Next. Unstated propositions. Well, we saw that in the last example. Next. This one's kind of wacky, right? Next. But it's really saying that. What's that form of argument? It looks like it might be modus tollens, right? Next. It's not. Because it's got nots doesn't mean it's modus tollens. The not is on the wrong thing. Later, next week, we'll do a bunch of these, and we'll do them formally so you can see what we're talking about. That's not modus tollens. Okay, next. Next, let's just whip through this. Okay, so deduction's powerful. Next. Validity can be counterintuitive. Next, here's why. A theorem can be valid with no premises. There's no relation between the premises and the conclusion. There doesn't even need to be premises. It's a theorem. It's logically true. All by itself, it's valid. Next. Logically false premises with a logically false conclusion gives you a valid argument. Let's say that I do this. This is the and symbol. The door is not open, and the door is open. Is there any scenario in which that can be the case? Don't get into it's cracked or anything like that, okay? I'm not talking vagueness here. If it's cracked even the slightest bit, it's open. Logically false premise. There is no scenario in which this premise can be true. Logically true conclusion. There's no scenario in which this conclusion can be false. Therefore, remember our definition of validity. An argument is valid if and only if there is no scenario in which all of the premises can be true and the conclusion false. There it is. There is no scenario in which that premise can be true. Therefore, there is no scenario in which that premise can be true and that conclusion false. We can make it even stronger than this, and even more counterintuitive. We can say, is that a valid argument? By our definition of validity, is that a valid argument? And you're groping and you're struggling, and why? Because you're not thinking formally. You think that you can only evaluate arguments once you know what they say. But what a philosopher is doing is telling you, before you even get bogged down in what the argument says, you first have to look at the structure of what is being said. And this is going to matter because as I show you what science is actually doing, I'm going to do it in formal representations. Okay? So this argument's valid because there is no scenario in which this premise could be true and the conclusion false. I don't care what the conclusion is. I don't care whether the conclusion could ever be true or false. It doesn't matter to me because there is no scenario in which this premise can be true. Therefore, there is no scenario in which this premise can be true and the conclusion can be false. So the argument is valid. At this point, you guys are going, oh, please, make it stop. But it matters. Because if you're not going to approach the subject carefully, rigorously, systematically, then you're just spouting off with opinions where everyone's opinion is as good as everyone else's opinion. And that's not philosophy. We are careful, we're systematic, we're rigorous, and we're going to draw solid conclusions. Next. Validity doesn't mean good. You look at this argument and you go, it's ridiculous. There's no way that's a good argument. And I will agree with you that it's unlikely that this argument is sound. No one caught me on that. What did I just say that was totally wrong? I said it's sound. This argument can't possibly be sound, or why? Soundness is a valid argument plus what? All the premises are true. Is there any scenario in which this premise can be true? No. Is there any scenario, it's valid, but is there any scenario in which that premise can be true? No. Therefore, it can never be sound. But I said, it's very unlikely this could be a sound argument. And this is a way I would test students. I would pop up an argument like this, and I would say, is it unlikely that that's a sound argument? Or true or false, these are horrible, right? True or false. It's unlikely that that is a sound argument. And the correct answer is false. Likelihood has nothing to do with it. That is an unsound argument. It's formally unsound. It cannot possibly be sound. There is no scenario in which the premise can possibly be true. Therefore, the argument is unsound. It's valid, but not sound. So notice, just because you have a valid argument doesn't mean you have a good argument. It doesn't mean you even have possibly a sound argument. You guys are starting to go, now I know why I hated philosophy classes, and now I'm No, this is good, clean fun. You know, you can't catch any disease doing this at all. This is as good, clean fun as it's possible to have, okay? And you're learning about thinking in very structured, very careful, very rigorous terms. Next. Notice it's called analytic philosophy. This isn't like history of ideas or historical philosophy. This is analysis. This is deeper than psychology. This is the very nature of thinking itself. Okay, validity is only about form. That's formally solid. Next. Doesn't mean the content's worth anything. So arguments are ultimately inferences. Next. Inferences can be evaluated formally with logic and informally. We deal with the content, we deal with fallacies. Next. Deduction allows for formal analysis. Next. Induction does not allow for formal analysis, but what we're after is looking at arguments to ask ourselves the question, if all those premises were true, would that actually get you the conclusion in the first place? Do you know that most people spend most of their time in arguments going round and round and round, talking past each other, and they're not even addressing whether or not what they're saying would even get to the conclusion they're trying to draw, even if you accepted the premises? Most people who argue are not getting clarity. You start getting clarity, and much of the dispute can go away. Next. Okay, this is my favorite example of this form versus content thing. Let's say that I put a clear glass, and it's empty. I put a clear glass on this table, and I ask you the question, does it taste good? Some of you are smiling. You're going, in, yet again, philosophical fashion, Jensen is asking ridiculous questions. Because that's what philosophers do, is ask ridiculous questions. I put an empty glass. What? Is this a Zen koan? What is the flavor of an empty glass, right? Like a Zen koan. It is a ridiculous question. It's a malformed question. Why? Because form has no flavor. Now, if I pour lemonade into the glass, and you like lemonade, you might say, lemonade tastes good. I like lemonade. It's a glass full of lemonade. Cool. Good lemonade. Can you taste lemonade completely apart from form? Think about it. Is it possible to know the flavor of the lemonade completely apart from all form? And you're thinking, I can come up with one. Let's say you take a handful of lemonade and you throw it in my direction, and I go, got it. Was it bereft of form? Did it have no form as it entered your mouth? It had the form that air and gravity, you'll get a blob, probably, depending on the distance, a pretty close to spherical blob entering your mouth. Does it or does it not have a form? Absolutely has a form. Let's say I pour lemonade on the floor, and you then reach down and lap some up. Does it have a form? Absolutely it has a form. Now it's a flat form, right? It is exactly this way in deduction. Without form, content is irrelevant. There is no point in talking about truth of premises until you know the form. Are you seeing this? I highly recommend that you don't just go, oh man, that was horrible, and never going to see it again. I encourage you to look at this video again. It's streamed. I encourage you to go through it again because it's critical that you process this stuff, that you think it through. The bottom line is, form is how content gets evaluated. But you can't ask about content talking only about form. Next. The form itself doesn't give you the flavor, but you don't get the flavor without form either. Next. Both form and content are needed to establish the flavor. So when we're talking about truth, it's ridiculous to talk about the truth of a conclusion in a vacuum, because a conclusion implies that there's some reasons to accept it, unless it's a theorem, okay? And so it's ridiculous to talk about truth until I have first said, what are you trying to convince me of? What inferential moves are you actually employing? And this is what we're going to do, precisely. This is what we're going to do in our analysis of science. We're going to look at the inferences. Remember, I call this evolutionary arguments, or an analysis of evolutionary arguments. We're going to look at the formal arguments of science and evolution, and we're going to not be asking, is evolution true? Is evolution false? We're going to be asking, is it even formally believable? Next. So, summary, next. We are going to proceed by argument analysis. Next. We are going to exercise charity in that analysis, and I guarantee you, as you look back at this thing, you're going to say, he was careful, man. Next. We are going to treat arguments as inductive or deductive, appropriate to what was intended. Next. We're going to look for validity or strength first. We're not going to get all bogged down in content until we first have figured out what form of argumentation is even going on. Next. And the conclusion truth question only emerges once we're clear on all of the above. So that's our process, and that is the end for today. But you're getting a taste now of how systematic and rigorous and careful this is going to be. And by the end, you are going to be able to say, and you're going to be able to point people back to this and say, science is not doing what the vast majority of people think science is doing, and evolutionary arguments are not good ones. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We'll see you at lunch.